दूसरे देश पर अटैक करने वाला है, बट उससे ठीक पहले वो एक ट्वीट पोस्ट करते हैं। इज दैट एन एक्ट ऑफ वॉर और इज इट डिप्लोमेसी? अजीब है ना? आज हम ऐसी ही कॉम्प्लिकेटेड सिचुएशंस को एथिकल लेंस से देखेंगे। इससे पहले कि हम शुरू करें, दोस्त फटाफट वो सब्सक्राइब बटन दबा दो, नोटिफिकेशन बेल ऑन कर लो और कमेंट में बताओ तुम्हारे लिए पीस का क्या मतलब है। लेट्स गेट दिस स्टार्टेड। तो आज का हमारा लर्निंग मैप कैसा दिखता है? हम 10 सुपर इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चंस कवर करेंगे, बिल्कुल एग्जाम स्टाइल में, ताकि सब कुछ क्रिस्टल क्लियर हो जाए। पहले हम समझेंगे कि क्या वॉर सच में डिप्लोमेसी का एक रूप है, कार्ल वॉन क्लॉज़विट्ज़ के नजरिए से। फिर ग्लोबल वार्मिंग और इंसानी लालच के कनेक्शन को एक्सप्लोर करेंगे। उसके बाद हम पीस, एक्शन और पावरफुल देशों की वेपन इंडस्ट्रीज के एथिकल एंगल को देखेंगे। हम इंटरनेशनल एड के पीछे की एथिक्स पर भी बात करेंगे। फिर आएगा रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर का एथिकल ब्रेकडाउन, कितना सफिशिएंट है, इस पर भी चर्चा होगी। रेफ्यूजीज और डेमोक्रेटिक देशों की मॉरल ड्यूटीज को भी समझेंगे। इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस में विल टू पावर को कैसे कंट्रोल किया जा सकता है, इस पर भी बात होगी। इसके बाद हम इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस के 3 पिलर्स, स्ट्रेंथ, पीस और सिक्योरिटी को इलुसिडेट करेंगे। और फाइनली हम देखेंगे कि एथिकल कंसिडरेशंस कैसे नेशंस के बीच टेंशंस को रिजॉल्व कर सकती हैं।
बिल्कुल, हर क्वेश्चन एक नया पर्सपेक्टिव ओपन करेगा। सो लेट्स गेट स्टार्टेड।
ओके, चलो शुरू करते हैं। फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम एथिक्स थ्योरी 2025 फॉर 10 मार्क्स। क्वेश्चन: Carl von Clausewitz once said, "War is a diplomacy by other means." Critically analyze the above statement in the present context of contemporary geopolitical conflict.
Broad micro theme: war as an extension of politics.
Clausewitz diktat in the 21st century. तो ये क्लॉज़विट्ज़ थे कौन? बेसिकली ये एक प्रशियन मिलिट्री स्ट्रैटेजिस्ट थे और उनका कहना था कि जब देश बातचीत से अपनी गोल्स अचीव नहीं कर पाते तो वो जंग का सहारा लेते हैं। यानी वॉर पॉलिटिक्स का ही एक वायलेंट एक्सटेंशन है। डिप्लोमेसी फेल हुई तो चलो वॉर करते हैं। सिंपल, राइट?
एग्जैक्टली। इसे ऐसे सोचो, इमेजिन अ चेस गेम। हर मूव का एक पॉलिटिकल गोल होता है, बोर्ड पर कंट्रोल करना। जब तुम्हारे नॉर्मल मूव्स जैसे बिशप या नाइट को मूव करना काम नहीं करते तो तुम एक अग्रेसिव मूव करते हो, जैसे क्वीन को सैक्रिफाइस करना। वो एग्रेसिव मूव ही वॉर है। गोल अभी भी वही है, टू विन द गेम, यानी कि पॉलिटिकल ऑब्जेक्टिव अचीव करना।
सुपर्ब एनालॉजी। तो चलो इस स्टेटमेंट को आज के जमाने में टेस्ट करते हैं। लेट्स सी हाउ वी कैन स्ट्रक्चर अ मॉडल आंसर। इंट्रोडक्शन: स्टार्ट बाय स्टेटिंग दैट क्लॉज़विट्ज़ थ्योरी व्हाइल सेंचुरीज ओल्ड रिमेन्स सरप्राइजिंगली रेलेवेंट। हम इसे आज के कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स जैसे रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर या साउथ चाइना सी टेंशंस के जरिए एनालाइज करेंगे।
परफेक्ट। अब आके बॉडी पर हम इसे 2 पार्ट्स में ब्रेक करेंगे। पहला, जहां हम क्लॉज़विट्ज़ से अग्री करेंगे विद मॉडर्न एग्जांपल्स। अंडरस्टैंडिंग क्लॉज़विट्ज़ असर्शन। फर्स्ट पॉइंट, पॉलिटिकल कंटिन्यूटी। देखो, रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर में मिलिट्री एक्शन के पीछे क्लियर पॉलिटिकल गोल्स है,
जैसे कि नेटो एक्सपेंशन को रोकना या स्पेसिफिक टेरिटरीज पर कंट्रोल करना।
बिल्कुल। इट्स नॉट रैंडम वायलेंस, इट्स अ पॉलिटिकल ऑब्जेक्टिव बीइंग परस्यूड थ्रू फोर्स। सेकंड, स्ट्रेटेजिक कोएर्शन। चाइना को देखो, साउथ चाइना सी में वो फुल स्केल वॉर नहीं कर रहा, बट अपनी मिलिट्री प्रेजेंस यूज करके, आर्टिफिशियल आइलैंड्स बना के वो दूसरे देशों पर डिप्लोमेटिक प्रेशर डाल रहा है। ये है हाइब्रिड वॉरफेयर। वॉर और डिप्लोमेसी के बीच की लाइन ब्लर हो जाती है, समझे?
इंटरेस्टिंग। तो ये आधी वॉर है और आधी डिप्लोमेसी।
एग्जैक्टली। थर्ड पॉइंट, इंस्ट्रूमेंटल वायलेंस। इजराइल पैलेस्टाइन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट में फोर्स का यूज ऑफन एक नेगोशिएटिंग पोजीशन को स्ट्रॉन्ग करने के लिए होता है। मतलब वायलेंस बिकम्स एन इंस्ट्रूमेंट, अ टूल टू गेट अ बेटर डील एट द टेबल। फोर्थ, स्टेट रैशनैलिटी।
और इसके लिए इंडिया की सर्जिकल स्ट्राइक्स 2016-2019 एक परफेक्ट एग्जांपल है ना?
है ना? ये एक ऑल आउट वॉर नहीं था। इट वाज अ कैलकुलेटेड रैशनल मिलिट्री रिस्पॉन्स, जिसका मकसद एक स्ट्रॉन्ग डिप्लोमेटिक मैसेज देना था, नॉट टू कैप्चर टेरिटरी। फिर आता है अलायंस बिल्डिंग। नेटो का एक्सपेंशन भी एक मिलिट्री पार्टनरशिप है, बट इसका बड़ा गोल डिप्लोमेटिक है, कलेक्टिव सिक्योरिटी और रशियन इन्फ्लुएंस को काउंटर करना। मिलिट्री अलायंस एज अ टूल ऑफ डिप्लोमेसी।
और आखिरी पॉइंट जो आजकल बहुत रेलेवेंट है, इकोनॉमिक वॉरफेयर।
राइट। आजकल तो वॉर सिर्फ बॉम्ब से नहीं लड़ी जाती। यूएस चाइना ट्रेड वॉर, जहां टैरिफ्स और सैंक्शंस यूज होते हैं, ये भी एक नॉन मिलिट्री फॉर्म ऑफ वॉर है विद क्लियर पॉलिटिकल गोल्स।
वाओ, दैट्स अ कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव लिस्ट ऑफ पॉइंट्स सपोर्टिंग हिम। बट द क्वेश्चन आस्क्ड टू क्रिटिकली एनालाइज। तो अब सेकंड पार्ट ऑफ द बॉडी, द काउंटर आर्गुमेंट्स।
बिल्कुल। 2. क्रिटिकल एनालिसिस ऑफ द स्टेटमेंट। पहला काउंटर है एथिकल लिमिटेशंस। यहाँ हम फिलोसोफर इमैनुअल कांत को ला सकते हैं। उनकी एथिक्स कहती है कि इंसानों को कभी भी एक मीन्स टू एन एंड या एक टूल की तरह यूज नहीं करना चाहिए।
Right.
और वॉर में सोल्जर्स और सिविलियंस की लाइव्स को पॉलिटिकल गोल्स के लिए यूज किया जाता है। ह्यूमन डिग्निटी का क्या? प्रिसाइसली। दूसरा पॉइंट है ह्यूमैनिटेरियन कंसर्न्स। जिनीवा कन्वेंशंस जैसे इंटरनेशनल लॉज हैं जो वॉर के कंडक्ट को रिस्ट्रिक्ट करते हैं। ये बताते हैं कि आप सिविलियंस को टारगेट नहीं कर सकते। तो वॉर नॉर्मल डिप्लोमेसी जैसा कैसे हो सकता है?
फेयर पॉइंट। तीसरा, एसिमेट्रिक कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स। क्लॉज़विट्ज़ की थ्योरी तो रैशनल स्टेट्स पर बेस्ड है, लेकिन टेररिज्म का क्या?
एग्जैक्टली। टेररिस्ट ग्रुप्स का अक्सर कोई क्लियर पॉलिटिकल ऑब्जेक्टिव नहीं होता जिसे नेगोशिएट किया जा सके। उनकी आइडियोलॉजी अलग होती है। फिर है न्यूक्लियर डिटरेंस। न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स ने गेम ही चेंज कर दिया। अब वॉर एक्चुअल फाइटिंग से ज्यादा एक साइकोलॉजिकल गेम है। The threat of mutually assured destruction means war is no longer a rational tool of politics. It's a suicide pact.
और नॉन स्टेट एक्टर्स का क्या, जैसे आईसिस या इंटरनेशनल कॉर्पोरेशंस?
Modern wars disproportionately affect civilians. क्या आम लोगों की जान देकर political goals achieve करना legitimate है?
बहुत सारे स्ट्रॉन्ग काउंटर आर्गुमेंट्स है।
Exactly. And now for the conclusion. तो हम कह सकते हैं कि Clausewitz की लिंक पॉलिटिक्स और वॉर के बीच में आज भी वैलिड है। However, the nature of conflict has changed. अब फोकस ब्रूट फोर्स से शिफ्ट होकर हाइब्रिड वॉरफेयर, इकोनॉमिक प्रेशर और स्ट्रेटेजिक डिप्लोमेसी पर आ गया है। असल सोल्यूशन डिप्लोमेसी को स्ट्रॉन्ग करने में है, न कि वॉर को डिप्लोमेसी का एक्सटेंशन मानने में।
ब्रिलियंट। चलो अब इस पर कुछ क्रॉस क्वेश्चंस करते हैं। फर्स्ट, how can a student structure this answer to showcase both sides of the argument effectively for maximum marks?
सिंपल। पहले आधी बॉडी में अग्री विद क्लॉज़विट्ज़ यूजिंग मॉडर्न एग्जांपल्स लाइक वी डिस्कस्ड, फिर एक क्लियर ट्रांजिशन दो जैसे however in the 21st century this statement faces several limitations, और फिर काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट्स प्रेजेंट करो। दिस शोज अ बैलेंस्ड व्यू।
Great tip. Second, what's the core difference between strategic coercion and instrumental violence in this context?
Strategic coercion is often about applying pressure without full-scale conflict, जैसे military drills दिखाना। Instrumental violence involves the actual use of limited military force to gain a bargaining advantage, जैसे एक specific target पर strike करना।
Got it. Third, इंडिया की सर्जिकल स्ट्राइक्स को स्टेट रैशनैलिटी का एग्जाम्पल क्यों कहा गया है? इसका क्या मतलब है?
इसका मतलब ये है कि a nation acts like a rational person. The action was controlled, limited, and had a very specific goal: to send a diplomatic message about terrorism. It wasn't an emotional, uncontrolled decision to start a war.
Right. Fourth, how does the concept of non-state actors like ISIS completely challenge Clausewitz's state-centric theory?
Clausewitz की theory assumes कि rational states are the main actors जो आपस में negotiate कर सकते हैं. Non-state actors like ISIS operate outside this framework. उनके goals often non-negotiable होते हैं और वो traditional diplomacy के rules को नहीं मानते.
Makes sense. And fifth, अगर ये क्वेश्चन एग्जाम में आए तो कंक्लूजन में क्या फ्यूचर ओरिएंटेड पॉइंट ऐड कर सकते हैं?
We can suggest that future conflicts will be dominated by cyber warfare and information warfare, making Clausewitz's core idea of war as a political tool relevant, but in a completely new, non-physical dimension.
Perfect. Now, dost, pause and practice saying this phrase. War is the continuation of politics by other means, but the modern context of asymmetric threats and nuclear deterrence demands a critical re-examination.
Practice it. In short, Clausewitz was right about the politics-war link, but 21st century ethics, non-state actors, and new forms of conflict have complicated his theory significantly.
Awesome. चलो अब आगे बढ़ते हैं एक ऐसे इशू पे जो हम सबको डायरेक्टली इफेक्ट करता है. Our second question is from Ethics Theory 2024. Question: Global warming and climate change are the outcomes of human greed. How do you put an end to this to protect life and bring equilibrium?
Broad micro theme: environmental ethics and human greed.
The greed crisis. Our planet on fire. ये क्वेश्चन सीधा ह्यूमन नेचर पे पॉइंट कर रहा है. ग्रीड. तो पहले देखते हैं हाउ हैज ह्यूमन ग्रीड लेड टू दिस क्राइसिस.
Imagine a beautiful cake. Greed is when you know everyone needs a slice, but you want to eat half of it yourself. हमने planet के साथ यही किया है. For a model answer, let's break it down. First, identify the manifestations of greed. Point 1. Over-exploitation of resources. हम resources को इतनी तेजी से यूज कर रहे हैं जितनी तेजी से वो replenish नहीं हो सकते.
जैसे अमेज़न रेन फॉरेस्ट को क्लियर किया जा रहा है फॉर पाम ऑयल एंड कैटल रंचिंग.
बिल्कुल. Second, consumerism and unsustainable lifestyles. Modern society में progress का मतलब है consumption. More cars, more gadgets, more fast fashion. हम जरूरत के लिए नहीं, शौक के लिए consume कर रहे हैं. That's greed. Third, profit over planet mentality. Corporations short-term financial gains को environmental well-being पर priority देते हैं.
इसका कोई क्लासिक एग्जांपल है?
19 Exxon Valdez oil spill. वहाँ cost cutting measures की वजह से एक massive environmental disaster हुआ. Fourth, weak environmental ethics. Policy making में economic growth GDP को हमेशा ज़्यादा importance दी जाती है over environmental protection. और fifth, global inequality. ये भी greed का एक form है. Historically, developed nations ने सबसे ज़्यादा pollute किया है to get rich. जैसे US का per capita emission इंडिया से काफ़ी ज़्यादा है.
राइट. और अब वो डेवलपिंग नेशंस एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं कि एमिशंस कट करें, व्हिच इज अनफेयर.
Exactly.
दैट्स अ पावरफुल ब्रेकडाउन ऑफ द प्रॉब्लम. तो अब आते हैं सोल्यूशन पर. हाउ डू वी रिस्टोर बैलेंस? द क्वेश्चन आस्क्स हाउ डू पुट एन एंड टू दिस.
The solution has to be as multifaceted as the problem. First, ethical environmental consciousness. सबसे पहले we need a shift in our values. हमें moderation, contentment और enoughness जैसे values को promote करना होगा. हमें गांधीयन dictum याद रखना है. The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed.
वाओ. सेकंड सोल्यूशन.
Sustainable development with moral accountability. हमें प्रोग्रेस के मेजर्स को रीडिफाइन करना होगा। जीडीपी के साथ साथ ग्रॉस नेशनल हैप्पीनेस या ग्रीन जीडीपी जैसे इंडिकेटर्स यूज करने होंगे। थर्ड, मॉडिफिकेशन ऑफ लाइफस्टाइल। हमें लो कार्बन लाइफस्टाइल्स अडॉप्ट करने होंगे। मिनिमलिज्म, सस्टेनेबल डाइट्स, पब्लिक ट्रांसपोर्ट।
जैसे इंडिया का लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरनमेंट मूवमेंट, राइट?
परफेक्ट एग्जाम्पल। फिर कॉर्पोरेट एनवायरमेंटल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी। कंपनीज को सीएसआर को सीरियसली लेना होगा, नॉट जस्ट एज अ पीआर स्टंट। ग्रीन वॉशिंग जैसी प्रैक्टिसेस को पीनलाइज करना होगा। उसके बाद स्ट्रेंथनिंग एनवायरमेंटल जस्टिस। क्लाइमेट पॉलिसीज इंक्लूसिव होनी चाहिए। सॉल्यूशंस मस्ट प्रायोरिटाइज द पुअर एंड मार्जिनलाइज्ड। एंड ऑफ कोर्स इंटरनेशनल कोऑपरेशन। डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज को अपनी हिस्टोरिकल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी एक्सेप्ट करनी चाहिए। द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ कॉमन बट डिफरेंशिएटेड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज इज की हियर।
और एजुकेशन का भी रोल होगा, एज्यूम।
बिल्कुल, एनवायरमेंटल एजुकेशन एंड मॉरल सेंसिटाइजेशन। स्कूल करिकुला से लेकर अवेयरनेस कैंपेन्स लाइक ग्रेटा थनबर्ग्स फ्राइडेज फॉर फ्यूचर मूवमेंट, और फाइनली रोल ऑफ पब्लिक सर्वेंट्स एंड सिटीजन्स। लोगों को एक्टिव रोल लेना होगा, जैसे इंडिया के चिपको मूवमेंट में हुआ, जहां लोग पेड़ों से चिपक गए थे टू सेव देम।
Brilliant. So the conclusion would be,
It's not just about technology, it's about a fundamental change in human values, from greed to guardianship.
fantastic. Now for the cross questions. First, how can we link Gandhian ethics to this answer effectively to make it stand out?
You should use his need versus greed quote in the introduction to frame the problem, and then again in the conclusion to reinforce the solution. This frames the entire answer around a central, powerful ethical principle.
Great. Second, what's a good way to structure the solutions part of the answer for better flow?
Structure it from the micro to the macro level. Start with individual lifestyle changes, then move to corporate responsibility, then national policies, and finally, international cooperation. It shows a holistic, 360-degree approach.
Perfect. Third, greenwashing kya hai? Can you give a simple, memorable explanation?
Greenwashing is when a company spends more time and money marketing itself as environmentally friendly than on actually minimizing its environmental impact. It's a PR tactic, plain and simple.
So it's all talk, no action. Fourth, how does global inequality make climate negotiations so complex?
It creates a trust deficit. Developing nations argue that developed countries who caused most of the historical pollution should bear more of the financial and technical burden. This concept, common but differentiated responsibilities, often leads to major disagreements in climate summits.
I see. And fifth, could the Chipko movement be used as a powerful case study for citizen-led environmentalism?
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of how grassroots movements, driven by strong environmental ethics, can successfully protect natural resources. It shows the power of the people.
Excellent. Time for the practice cue, dost. Let's practice saying this. The climate crisis is fundamentally a crisis of ethics stemming from human greed, and it requires a moral transformation towards sustainable living and global justice. Rehearse that.
In short, human greed caused the climate crisis, and the solution lies in a multi-level ethical shift from individual consciousness to binding international cooperation.
Let's move to the next question. This one is from Ethics, Theory 2024, and it's about peace. Question. It is not enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it, and it is not enough to believe in it, one must act upon it. What are the ethical considerations of the powerful nations?
Broad micro theme: the ethics of peace and the arms industry.
सिर्फ बातें करना काफी नहीं है, एक्शन जरूरी है. बट पावरफुल नेशंस अक्सर पीस की बात करते हैं, लेकिन उनकी एक्शंस कुछ और ही कहती हैं.
ये एक बहुत बड़ा पैराडॉक्स है.
बिल्कुल. The top 5 arms exporters in the world are also permanent members of the UN Security Council, जिनका काम है पीस मेंटेन करना. Cool ना? The irony.
It's a huge ethical contradiction. These powerful nations' weapon industries often fuel the very conflicts they are supposed to prevent. Let's structure the answer. Introduction. Start by explaining the quote and immediately introduce the paradox. While powerful nations champion peace in forums like the UN, their role as the world's largest arms suppliers creates a deep ethical conflict.
Perfect start. अब body में problem को कैसे highlight करें?
Body. The problem. First point. The military-industrial complex. This term refers to the close, profitable relationship between a nation's military, its defense industry, and its government. Basically, wars become profitable for them. Second, fueling conflicts for profit. These weapons often go to conflict-ridden regions like West Asia and East Europe. The war in Yemen is a classic example.
वहाँ Western-made weapons use हुए, जिससे एक massive humanitarian crisis हुआ.
Exactly. Third, proxy wars. ये एक मॉडर्न तरीका है कॉन्फ्लिक्ट का. जैसे इन द रशिया-यूक्रेन वॉर, NATO countries are supplying weapons to Ukraine. It's a way to fight an adversary without direct confrontation, but it prioritizes national interest over the ethical responsibility of de-escalation.
So that's the problem, the hypocrisy. Now, what are the ethical considerations? The question asks what these powerful nations should do.
Exactly. Here are the key ethical duties. First, moral responsibility as global leaders. The principle of noblesse oblige applies here. With great power comes greater responsibility. They should lead disarmament, not the arms race.
Second, humanitarian prioritization over strategic gains. मतलब empathy और human cost को profit या geopolitics से ऊपर रखना.
Yes. Third, integrity and consistency in diplomacy. उनके words और actions में consistency होनी चाहिए. You cannot call for peace on Monday and sign $1 billion arms deal on Tuesday. Fourth, consequentialism. This ethical theory says that the morality of an action depends on its consequences. The consequences of reckless arms exports are civilian deaths and refugee crises.
So they must consider the long-term human cost.
Correct? Fifth, ethical realism. Traditional realism in IR focuses purely on national interest. Ethical realism suggests that it is in a nation's long-term interest to also consider the global good. And finally, transparency and accountability in arms trade. They must bring ethical scrutiny to defense deals. Treaties like the Arms Trade Treaty, ATT, should be strictly upheld.
इसका कोई positive example है?
Yes, Norway. उन्होंने Yemen war में involved countries को arms exports suspend कर दिए due to ethical concerns. That's moral leadership in action.
So the conclusion should emphasize the change in priorities.
Precisely. Conclusion. True peace requires powerful nations to act on their words. It demands the moral courage to choose humanity over hegemony and profit. The path to real peace is not through the barrel of a gun, but through genuine ethical diplomacy.
Got it. Time for cross questions. First, how would one start an answer on this topic to be most impactful?
Start by directly explaining the quote's meaning, then immediately create the paradox. While nations preach peace, their actions in the global arms trade often fuel conflict. This sets a strong, critical tone right from the beginning.
Great. Second, can you explain the term military-industrial complex in a simple, memorable way?
It's the powerful trio of a country's military, the arms companies that supply it, and the politicians who fund it. The danger is that this trio might push for war because it's good for business.
Okay, that's very clear. Third, how is ethical realism different from regular realism? Regular realism says a country should only care about its own power and survival. Ethical realism is smarter. It says that in the long run, caring about the global good is in your national interest. Because a stable world is a safer world for everyone.
Makes sense.
Fourth, in the context of the Yemen war, what specific ethical principle was violated by arms suppliers?
The principle of non-maleficence, which is a fancy way of saying do no harm. By supplying weapons that were used against civilians, they directly contributed to immense harm.
Got it. And a strong concluding thought for this answer.
Conclude by saying that true peace is not just the absence of war, negative peace, but the presence of justice, positive peace. And justice demands that powerful nations choose humanity over hegemony and profit.
Powerful stuff. All right, those, practice time. Let's practice saying this phrase. Ethical international conduct demands the moral courage for powerful nations to choose humanity over hegemony and disarmament over the arms trade. Practice it.
In short, true peace requires powerful nations to act on their words, prioritize human life over profit, and take moral responsibility for the devastating consequences of their arms trade.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. This is question 4 from Ethics Theory 2023. Question. International aid is an accepted form of helping resource-challenged nations. Comment on ethics in contemporary international aid.
Broad micro-theme. The ethical dilemmas of international aid.
The helping hand or the hidden fist? International aid. मतलब एक देश दूसरे देश की मदद कर रहा है. On the surface, it seems like a very noble thing. But इसके पीछे बहुत सारे ethical issues छिपे हैं.
Absolutely, it's a very gray area. Let's break down the ethical problems in contemporary aid. First, paternalism and conditionality. अक्सर aid strings attached के साथ आती है. The donor country says, हम तुम्हें aid देंगे, but you have to adopt our economic policies.
This is paternalistic. मतलब like a father telling a child what to do.
It undermines the recipient country's sovereignty.
Exactly.
A famous example is the World Bank and IMF's structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s, which forced countries to privatize their public services.
Second, transparency and accountability. Corruption and inefficiency are huge problems. Aid money often doesn't reach the people who need it.
इसका कोई real life example है?
The Paradise Papers leak exposed how some aid money was being channeled into offshore tax havens.
Third, used as a geopolitical tool. Aid is often used not to help, but to gain influence.
जैसे चाइना की Belt and Road Initiative.
Perfect example. Critics call it debt trap diplomacy, where China gives massive loans that countries can't repay and then gains control over strategic assets like ports. Fourth, ethical concerns in emergency relief. Sometimes help comes too late. The delayed international response in the 1994 Rwandan genocide is a tragic example. And fifth, sustainability and dependency. अगर एड ऐसे दी जाए कि वो लोकल कैपेसिटी बिल्ड ना करे तो वो डिपेंडेंसी क्रिएट कर सकती है. इट्स द क्लासिक गिव अ मैन अ फिश वर्सेस टीच अ मैन टू फिश प्रॉब्लम.
So, if this is the reality, what should be the ideals of international aid? What does ethical aid look like?
Ethical aid should be guided by a different set of principles. First, altruism and compassion. The primary motive should be genuine human concern, not national self-interest. Organizations like Doctors Without Borders, MSF, are a great example.
They go wherever the need is greatest, irrespective of politics.
Yes. Second, global solidarity and justice. Ethical aid shouldn't be seen as charity done, but as justice. It's an acknowledgement that we have a moral obligation to rectify historical inequities. Third, respect for sovereignty and self-determination. Aid should be a partnership of equals. The recipient country should be in the driver's seat. Fourth, accountability and transparency. There must be strict mechanisms to track the money on both sides. And finally, empowerment and capacity building. The focus should be on building long-term, self-sustaining systems.
कोई देश इस मॉडल को फॉलो करता है.
Japan's Official Development Assistance, ODA, is often cited as a good model because it focuses on skills transfer and technical cooperation.
So, the conclusion is a call for a paradigm shift.
Yes. The key takeaway is that ethical international aid must move from top-down donor-centric models to inclusive, empowering partnerships built on respect and shared goals.
Let's get to the cross questions. First, what is the main ethical difference between seeing aid as charity and seeing it as justice?
Charity implies a voluntary act of giving from the powerful to the weak. It's optional. Justice implies a moral obligation to rectify historical wrongs and ensure everyone has basic rights, making aid a duty, not just a choice.
That's a huge difference. Second, how exactly does conditionality undermine a nation's sovereignty?
It forces a country to adopt policies, like privatization or austerity, that its own democratically elected government might not choose. In essence, the donor dictates the country's internal policies.
Got it. Third, can you explain debt trap diplomacy with the BRI example more simply?
Imagine, someone gives you a huge loan to build a fancy house you can't really afford. When you can't pay back, they take over your house. Critics say China does this with countries, giving them huge loans for ports or railways. When the country defaults, China can gain control of that strategic asset.
That's a very clear analogy. Fourth, what is a practical step to increase transparency in aid?
Creating public online portals where citizens of both countries can track every single dollar of aid, where it comes from, what it's for, and how it's being spent in real time.
That sounds like a great idea. And fifth, how can aid foster empowerment instead of dependency?
By investing in local systems. Instead of flying in foreign doctors, train local doctors. Instead of importing food, invest in local agriculture. The goal should be to help them build their own capacity.
Excellent. Let's practice dost. Rehearse this line. Ethical aid is a partnership for empowerment, not a paternalistic handout. It must shift from charity to justice.
In short, international aid is ethically complex, and to be truly helpful, it must shift from a conditional donor-driven model to one based on justice, transparency, and genuine empowerment of local communities.
Excellent. All right. Next up is a very current and sensitive topic. Question 5 from Ethics Theory 2022. Question. The Russia and Ukraine war. What are those ethical issues that are crucial to be considered while launching the war and its continuation?
Broad micro-theme. Ethical analysis of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
War in the modern age. An ethical breakdown. This is a tough one. The Russia-Ukraine war has dominated headlines. तो जब हम इसे ethical lens से देखते हैं, हमें किस framework का use करना चाहिए?
The best framework here is the just war theory. It's an ancient concept, but still very relevant. It has two main parts. Jus ad bellum, the ethics of starting a war, and jus in bello, the ethics of conduct during a war.
Okay, so let's break it down using that framework. Pele, jus ad bellum, the reasons for starting the war.
Right. According to this theory, a war is just only if it meets several criteria. Let's see how the Russia-Ukraine conflict stacks up. First, just cause. War can only be waged to correct a grave public evil, like aggression. Ukraine would argue they're fighting a just war of self-defense against an invasion. Russia argues its special military operation is a just cause to protect Russian speakers and prevent NATO expansion. This is highly contested.
Second, right intention. The primary goal must be to establish a just peace, not for territorial gain or revenge. Again, both sides claim their intentions are right, but the international community has largely questioned Russia's intentions.
Third, proper authority and public declaration. A war must be declared by a legitimate authority. While Putin is the legitimate head of state, the way the war was launched has been criticized as lacking full democratic or international sanction. Fourth, last resort. War should only be an option after all peaceful alternatives, like diplomacy, have been exhausted. Critics argue that Russia did not fully exhaust diplomatic channels before invading.
And the last two criteria.
And proportionality, which means the good achieved by the war must outweigh the evil it causes. Given the massive destruction and loss of life, many argue the war fails the proportionality test.
So based on jus et bellum, there are serious ethical questions about the start of the war. What about jus in bello, the conduct during the war?
This is where the violations are even clearer. There are two main principles here. First, discrimination. This means you must distinguish between combatants and non-combatants civilians. Attacks on civilian areas like apartment buildings, schools and hospitals in Ukraine are a clear violation of this principle. The bombing of the Mariupol theater is a tragic example.
That's a direct war crime.
Absolutely. The second principle is proportionality again. The force used must be proportional to the military objective. The use of indiscriminate weapons, like cluster munitions or thermobaric weapons, in populated areas is seen as a disproportionate use of force.
और इसके अलावा कोई other ethical issues हैं?
Yes, the humanitarian crisis itself is a huge ethical issue. Millions of refugees, a looming food crisis, because Ukraine is a major grain exporter. There's also the issue of information warfare and propaganda. Both sides have used it, which creates a fog of war and makes it difficult to ascertain the truth, which is an ethical problem in itself.
So the conclusion would be a pretty strong condemnation from an ethical standpoint.
Yes. To conclude, the Russia-Ukraine war, when analyzed through the just war theory, raises profound ethical questions. The continuation of the conflict, with its devastating impact on civilians and disregard for the principles of jus in bello, represents a significant failure of ethical conduct in modern warfare.
Heavy stuff. Let's do the cross questions. First, in an exam, how can a student present the just war theory clearly?
The best way is to create two clear subheadings. Jus ad bellum, justice of war, and jus in bello, justice in war. Under each, list the principles as bullet points and then apply them to the conflict with specific examples.
Very structured.
Second, what is the core ethical problem with targeting civilian infrastructure, like power grids? It violates the principle of discrimination. But more than that, it's an attempt to break the morale of the civilian population by making their lives unlivable. It weaponizes winter and suffering, which is ethically reprehensible.
Third, could you simply explain proportionality in just in bello?
Imagine you see a fly on a wall. You could swat it with a newspaper. That's proportional. Or you could use a sledgehammer, destroying the wall in the process. That's disproportionate. In war, if your goal is to take out a sniper in a building, destroying the entire city block is a disproportionate use of force.
Great analogy. Fourth, how does information warfare become an ethical issue?
Because it dehumanizes the enemy and justifies atrocities. When propaganda paints the other side as evil or less than human, it makes it easier for soldiers and the public to accept violence against them. It erodes the moral fabric.
And a final question. What is the single most important ethical takeaway from this conflict for future leaders?
That in the 21st century, the cost of conventional warfare is unacceptably high. The ethical imperative must always be to prioritize de-escalation and diplomacy, because once war starts, ethical lines are almost always crossed.
A sobering thought. Okay, dost, let's practice this. Rehearse this line. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is a stark reminder that the principles of just war theory, especially discrimination and proportionality, are not abstract ideals, but crucial safeguards for humanity.
In short, from the perspective of just war theory, the Russia-Ukraine conflict demonstrates significant ethical failures, particularly in its disregard for civilian life and the disproportionate destruction it has caused.
Okay, let's shift gears from geopolitics to the corporate world. Question 6 from Ethics, Theory 2022. Question: do you think corporate social responsibility, CSR, is efficient and sufficient enough to fulfill the social roles and responsibilities? Critically examine.
Broad micro theme: evaluating corporate social responsibilities, CSR.
CSR, genuine change or a PR stunt?
CSR यानी कॉर्पोरेट सोशल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी। ये आइडिया है कि कंपनीज को सिर्फ प्रॉफिट नहीं कमाना चाहिए, उन्हें सोसाइटी के लिए भी कुछ अच्छा करना चाहिए।
Sounds great, right?
It does. And in India, we even have a law, the Companies Act of 2013, which mandates that certain large companies must spend 2% of their average net profits on CSR activities. But the question is it efficient and sufficient?
Let's start with the for argument. CSR को efficient और जरूरी क्यों माना जाता है?
There are some strong points in its favor. First, it fills governance gaps. In many areas, especially in developing countries, the government can't provide all the necessary services. Companies, with their resources, can step in and help with education, healthcare, sanitation, etc.
Like the Tata Group's work in community development in places like Jamshedpur.
Exactly. A classic example. Second, it promotes sustainable business practices. Many CSR initiatives focus on environmental sustainability, which is good for the planet and can also be good for the company's long-term profitability. Third, it enhances brand image and reputation. Consumers today are more conscious. They prefer to buy from companies that are seen as ethical. So good CSR can be a competitive advantage. And fourth, it improves employee morale. Employees feel proud to work for a company that gives back to society.
Okay, so there are clear benefits. But the question asks us to critically examine. So, what are the arguments against CSR being sufficient?
This is the crucial part. There are many limitations. First, it's often seen as a PR exercise or greenwashing. Many companies use CSR to create a positive image, while their core business practices are harmful. For example, a fossil fuel company might fund a small park, while its main business is causing massive pollution.
So, it's a way to distract from the real damage.
Precisely. Second, the 2% mandate is often seen as a maximum, not a minimum. Companies might feel that once they've spent their 2%, their social responsibility is over. It becomes a box-ticking exercise. Third, it can be inefficient and lack strategic focus. Companies might just donate money to a cause without ensuring it's being used effectively, or they might spread their efforts too thinly across many small projects. Fourth, it doesn't address core ethical issues. CSR doesn't stop a company from having exploitative labor practices or evading taxes or creating unsafe products. The real responsibility lies in ethical core operations, not in peripheral charity.
So, CSR is like a band-aid on a much deeper wound.
That's a great way to put it.
So, what's the conclusion? Is CSR a failure?
Not a failure, but insufficient. The conclusion should be that while CSR is a positive and necessary step, it is not sufficient to fulfill a company's total social responsibility. The future lies in moving beyond CSR to corporate social accountability, where ethical and social considerations are integrated into the core business strategy itself, not just treated as an afterthought.
Let's jump into the cross questions. First, how can a student structure this answer to show both sides clearly?
Create two main sections, arguments for the efficiency of CSR and arguments for the insufficiency of CSR. Use clear headings and examples for both, and then use the conclusion to synthesize these two views.
Second, could you give another clear example of greenwashing?
Imagine a fast fashion brand that releases a small conscious collection made from recycled materials and markets it heavily. But 99% of their business is still based on producing cheap, disposable clothing with underpaid labor. That's greenwashing.
Got it. Third, what is the key difference between CSR and the corporate social accountability you mentioned?
CSR is often external, doing charity outside the company. Corporate social accountability is internal. It's about how you make your money in the first place. Are your supply chains ethical? Do you pay fair wages? Do you pay your taxes? It's about accountability in every single business process.
That's a critical distinction. Fourth, why is a box-ticking approach to CSR ineffective?
Because it lacks genuine intent and impact. The goal becomes spending the money rather than solving the problem. It leads to poorly planned projects that don't create sustainable long-term change in the community.
And finally, what's a future-oriented thought to add to the conclusion?
We can suggest that future consumers and investors will demand radical transparency. They won't just look at a company's CSR report, but will use technology like blockchain to track a product's entire supply chain to ensure it's ethical from start to finish.
The future is accountability. Okay, dost, time to practice. Rehearse this sentence. While CSR is a necessary first step, it is insufficient. True corporate responsibility requires embedding ethical accountability into the core business strategy.
In short, CSR is a good start, but often serves as a PR tool. To be truly sufficient, companies must move from peripheral charity to core operational accountability.
Moving on to a deeply human issue. Question 7 from Ethics. Theory 2021. Question. Refugees should not be turned back to the country where they would face prosecution or human rights violation. Examine the statement.
Broad micro-theme: the moral imperative of protecting refugees.
The principle of non-refoulement, a moral red line. This statement is at the heart of international refugee law. ये कह रहा है कि हम refugees को वापस उस देश में नहीं भेज सकते जहां उनकी जान को खतरा हो.
Exactly. This is called the principle of non-refoulement. It's the cornerstone of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's considered a fundamental human right. Let's examine the ethical foundations of this principle.
Okay, so what are the main ethical arguments in favor of this statement?
There are several powerful ones. First, the Kantian categorical imperative. Philosopher Immanuel Kant said we should act in a way that we would want everyone else to act. We must treat humanity, in ourselves and others, always as an end and never as a means only. Sending a refugee back to face persecution is using their life as a means to an end, like national security or border control. It violates their inherent human dignity.
So it's about respecting every individual's worth.
Precisely. Second, utilitarianism. This theory focuses on maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering. The suffering of a refugee being sent back to face torture or death is immense. This suffering almost always outweighs the administrative or security benefits a country might gain by turning them away.
So from a greatest good perspective, protecting them is the right thing to do.
Yes. Third, the veil of ignorance. This is a thought experiment by philosopher John Rawls. He asks us to imagine we are designing a society without knowing what our position in it will be, rich, poor, citizen or refugee. From behind this veil of ignorance, we would all choose a system that protects refugees because we ourselves might end up being one. It's about creating a just and fair system for all.
That's a very powerful idea. Are there any real-world examples that highlight this principle?
Yes, the Rohingya crisis is a stark example. The Rohingya people fled persecution in Myanmar. Countries like Bangladesh, despite their own resource challenges, gave them refuge, upholding the principle of non-refoulement. This is a powerful act of moral responsibility.
Okay, so the ethical case is very strong, but countries often cite reasons for not following this. What are the counter-arguments or challenges?
These are practical and political challenges, but it's important to understand them. First, national security concerns. Governments argue that it's difficult to distinguish genuine refugees from terrorists or criminals who might be hiding among them. This leads to stricter border controls. Second, economic strain. Hosting a large number of refugees puts a strain on a country's resources, housing, jobs, social services. This can lead to social tension. And third, sovereignty. Some argue that every nation has the sovereign right to control its own borders and decide who can enter.
So, how do we balance these concerns with the moral duty to protect?
That's the key question for the conclusion. The conclusion is that while national security and economic concerns are valid, they cannot be used to completely override the fundamental moral duty to protect human life. The challenge for democratic nations is to find a way to manage these practical issues through fair and efficient asylum processes and international cooperation, without abandoning the core ethical principle of non-refoulement. Human dignity must come first.
Excellent. Let's tackle the cross questions. First, for an exam answer, how should one start examining this statement?
Start by defining the core concept. This statement articulates the principle of non-refoulement, which is the cornerstone of international refugee law and is grounded in profound ethical duties.
This immediately shows a clear understanding of the topic. Second, could you explain Kant's categorical imperative in an even simpler way in this context?
It basically means don't do something to someone if you wouldn't want it to become a universal law for everyone. You wouldn't want a law that says send people back to be harmed, so you shouldn't do it to anyone, ever. It's a universal moral rule.
Very clear. Third, how does the Rohingya crisis serve as a case study? What does it teach us?
It teaches us that upholding moral principles often comes at a great cost. Bangladesh faced immense strain, but they chose humanity over convenience. It shows that this isn't just a theoretical debate, it has real-world consequences and requires immense moral courage from nations.
Fourth, when a country cites national security, what is the ethical counter-response?
The ethical response is that security should not be achieved by sacrificing justice. A country can strengthen its security through robust and fair screening processes for asylum seekers, not by implementing a blanket policy of turning everyone away, which punishes the innocent along with the potentially guilty.
And a final challenging question. Does a country's moral obligation change if the refugees are from a culture very different from its own?
Ethically, no. Principles like human dignity and the duty to prevent suffering are universal. They apply to all human beings, regardless of their nationality, religion, or culture. To argue otherwise is to create a hierarchy of human worth, which is ethically indefensible.
A very important point. Okay, dost, let's get this into our heads. Practice saying, the principle of non-refoulement is a fundamental moral imperative, grounding a nation's security concerns in the universal duty to uphold human dignity.
In short, protecting refugees from being returned to danger is a core ethical duty based on principles of human dignity and justice, which must be balanced but not overridden by national interests.
Now let's talk about power. Question 8 from Ethics Theory 2020. Question: the will to power exists, but it can be tamed and be guided by rationality and principles of moral duty. Examine the statement in the context of international relations.
Broad micro theme: taming the will to power in global politics.
Power, morality and the global stage. The will to power. ये phrase philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche से जुड़ा है.
इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस में इसका मतलब है कि हर देश, हर स्टेट फंडामेंटली अपनी पावर बढ़ाना चाहता है।
Exactly. This is the core idea of the realism school of thought in IR, heavily influenced by thinkers like Hans Morgenthau. They believe that international politics is a constant struggle for power. Morality is secondary. But the statement claims this will to power can be tamed. That's where the debate begins.
So let's first examine the part that says the will to power exists. How do we see this in the world?
We see it everywhere. First, in the form of an arms race. Countries constantly build up their military capabilities to be stronger than their rivals. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union was a classic example. Second, economic competition. Nations compete for control over resources, markets, and trade routes. The US-China trade war is a modern manifestation of this economic will to power. Third, geopolitical expansion. We see this in actions like China's expansion in the South China Sea or historical examples of colonialism. It's about increasing one's sphere of influence.
So the existence of the will to power is undeniable. Now for the crucial part, how can it be tamed and guided?
This is where we bring in the counter-arguments to pure realism. First, it can be tamed by rationality. A purely power-hungry state might act recklessly, but a rational state understands that unchecked aggression can lead to devastating wars that are not in its own long-term interest. The concept of nuclear deterrence is a prime example. The rationality of avoiding mutual destruction tames the will to use the ultimate power.
So self-interest itself can be a taming force.
Precisely. Second, it can be guided by principles of moral duty. This is the Kantian idea again. The belief that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of the consequences for power. For example, the moral duty to prevent genocide can lead to humanitarian interventions even if it doesn't directly increase a nation's power. Third, international law and institutions. Organizations like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Criminal Court create a framework of rules that constrain a state's raw will to power. They provide a platform for diplomacy over conflict.
So institutions act as the referees in the game.
Yes. And fourth, democracy and public opinion. In democratic countries, leaders are accountable to their citizens. If the public has a strong moral conscience, it can prevent leaders from pursuing overly aggressive or unethical foreign policies.
This sounds like a much more optimistic view of international relations. So how do we conclude?
The conclusion is a synthesis. While the realist concept of the will to power is a powerful explanatory tool for understanding international relations, it is not an uncontrollable force of nature. It can and must be tamed by the forces of rationality, moral duty, international law, and democratic accountability to create a more stable and just world order.
Great. Let's get to the cross questions. First, how can we effectively introduce both Nietzsche, Morgenthau, and Kant in the answer?
Start by introducing the will to power as the central idea of realism, citing Morgenthau. Then, frame the taming part of the statement as a challenge to realism, introducing Kantian deontology, moral duty, and liberal ideas, international institutions, as the taming forces.
That sets up a nice debate structure. Second, is nuclear deterrence a moral way to tame power?
That's a deep ethical question. On one hand, it has prevented large-scale wars between major powers, a good outcome. On the other hand, it relies on the threat of unimaginable destruction, which is morally horrifying. It's a paradox, a terrifyingly immoral threat that has so far produced a somewhat moral outcome of peace between superpowers.
Wow, that's complex. Third, how do international institutions like the UN practically tame power?
They do it in three ways: by setting international norms, what is acceptable behavior, by providing a forum for dialogue to prevent conflicts, and by imposing costs for breaking the rules, such as through sanctions. They can't always stop a powerful nation, but they can make it much harder and more costly for them to act unilaterally.
Right. Fourth, can you give an example of public opinion taming the will to power?
Protests against the Iraq War in 2003 are a good example. While they didn't stop the war, they showed that a government's pursuit of power could be strongly contested by its own citizens and the global community, creating a significant political cost for the leaders.
And a final question. Does the will to power only apply to states?
Originally, yes. But in the modern world, we can also see a will to power in large multinational corporations that seek economic dominance, or even in non-state actors like terrorist groups who seek ideological influence. The concept has expanded beyond just states.
Fascinating. Okay, everyone, let's practice this. Rehearse. While the realist's will to power is a persistent force, it is not absolute. It can be tamed by the countervailing forces of rationality, moral duty, and international law.
In short, the drive for power is real in global politics, but it's not the only force. It can be effectively constrained and guided by rationality, international laws, and shared moral principles.
We're getting close to the end. Question 9, from Ethics Theory 2017. Question. Strength, peace, and security are considered to be the pillars of international relations. Elucidate.
Broad micro-theme, the 3 pillars of international relations.
The interconnected trio. Strength, peace, security. This question presents 3 concepts, strength, peace, and security, as the pillars of IR. Let's elucidate or explain how they relate to each other. They seem connected, but how?
They are deeply interconnected, and often in a complex, sometimes paradoxical relationship. A good answer will explore this interplay. Let's look at each pillar and then see how they connect.
Okay, let's start with strength. What does that mean in IR?
Traditionally, strength meant military power, a strong army, advanced weapons. This is the realist view. A strong nation can deter attacks and impose its will. But today, strength is a much broader concept. It also includes economic strength, a strong GDP, technological innovation, diplomatic strength, strong alliances, influence in international institutions, and what we call soft power, the appeal of a country's culture, values, and policies.
So strength isn't just about having tanks and missiles anymore.
Not at all. Now for second pillar, peace. Here we need to make an important distinction. There is negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is simply the absence of war or direct violence. A ceasefire is negative peace. Positive peace, a concept from Johann Galtung, is much deeper. It's the presence of justice, equality, and harmonious social structures. It's a society where the root causes of conflict have been addressed.
So, 2 countries not shooting at each other is negative peace, but 2 countries with fair trade, cultural exchange, and mutual respect is positive peace.
You've got it perfectly. And the third pillar, security. Like strength, the definition of security has also expanded. The traditional view was national security, focused on protecting a state's borders from military attack. But the modern concept is human security. This focuses on protecting individuals from threats like poverty, disease, environmental disasters, and human rights abuses. Climate change is a major human security threat today, even though it's not a military one.
Okay, so we've defined the 3 pillars.
Yes.
Now the main task. How do they connect? How do they support each other?
This is the core of the answer. First, the strength-security link. The traditional view is that more strength leads to more security. If I have a bigger army, I am safer. This is the logic of deterrence. But there's a paradox here called the security dilemma. When one country increases its strength, builds more weapons, to feel more secure, it makes its neighbors feel less secure. They then build more weapons, and you end up in an arms race where no one is actually safer.
So pursuing strength can sometimes lead to less security.
Exactly. Now the peace-security link. It seems obvious that peace leads to security. But what kind of peace? Negative peace, just the absence of war, can be very fragile. True, lasting security comes from positive peace, where justice and cooperation remove the reasons for fighting in the first place. And finally, the strength-peace link. Can strength bring peace? Realists would say yes. A balance of power or a dominant hegemon can enforce peace. This is called Pax Romana or Pax Britannica. But others argue that a true, sustainable peace cannot be built on domination. It must be built on mutual respect, international law, and what we might call moral strength rather than just military strength.
So what is the ideal relationship between these 3 pillars?
The conclusion should be that these 3 pillars are not independent but form a dynamic triangle. For a stable international order, they must be in balance. An overemphasis on military strength at the expense of justice, positive peace, and human security will ultimately lead to instability. True, lasting security is achieved when a nation's strength is used not for domination, but to foster positive peace and human security for all.
Excellent breakdown. Let's do the cross questions. First, how can a student visually structure this answer?
A simple diagram of a triangle with strength, peace, and security at the corners could be a great way to start. Then the answer can explain the links along each side of the triangle. Strength, security, peace, security, etc., making the explanation very clear.
Great idea. Second, can you explain the security dilemma with a simple analogy?
Imagine 2 neighbors. One feels a bit unsafe, so he builds a high fence. The other neighbor sees the high fence and thinks, why is he building that? Is he planning something against me? So he buys a guard dog. The first neighbor sees the guard dog and feels even more unsafe, so he installs security cameras. Both spent resources to feel safer, but now both are more suspicious and less secure than before. That's the security dilemma.
Perfect analogy. Third, what is the main difference in focus between national security and human security?
National security asks, is the state safe from external attack? The object of security is the state. Human security asks, are the people within the state safe from threats like hunger, disease, and violence? The object of security is the individual human being. It's a fundamental shift in perspective.
Fourth, why is positive peace considered more stable than negative peace?
That cause the conflict in the first place. Positive peace addresses these root causes, making it much less likely for violence to break out again.
And a final question, is soft power a more ethical form of strength than military power?
Generally, yes. Soft power is the power of attraction and persuasion, not coercion. It's about getting others to want what you want. It's based on respect and shared values, which is inherently more ethical than forcing someone to do something through the threat of violence.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, dost, let's practice. Rehearse this sentence. True international stability rests on a balanced interplay of its three pillars. Strength, redefined to include soft power, security, expanded to human security, and peace, elevated from negative to positive peace.
In short, strength, peace, and security are interconnected pillars of IR. Lasting stability is achieved not by maximizing military strength alone, but by balancing it with a commitment to positive peace and human security.
And now a final question of this deep dive. From Ethics, Theory, 2015. Question, bilateral relations between most nations are governed by the policy of promoting one's own national interest. How can ethical considerations help resolve such tensions? Discuss with specific examples.
Broad micro theme: ethics as a solution to national interest conflicts.
Beyond self-interest, ethics as a bridge.
Okay, this question gets to the heart of the matter. It says that most countries just look out for themselves, their national interest. This often leads to tension and conflict. So how can ethics help? This is a direct challenge to the realist idea that national interest is the only thing that matters. The question asks for an ethical alternative. Let's first understand why the pursuit of national interest creates tension. It's because it often leads to a zero-sum game mentality.
A zero-sum game. What's that?
It's the belief that, for me to win, you must lose. My gain is your loss. If two countries are competing for the same limited resource, one's national interest is in direct conflict with the other's.
Right, so how can ethical considerations change this game?
Ethics can help transform this zero-sum game into a positive-sum game, where everyone can win, a win-win situation. Here are the ethical considerations that can help. First, the principle of shared humanity and mutual respect. This is the idea that despite our different nationalities, we are all part of one human family. India's ancient philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, is a perfect articulation of this. When you see another nation not as a competitor but as part of your family, your approach to resolving disputes changes completely.
So it starts with a change in perspective.
Absolutely. Second, the ethical principle of empathy. This means trying to understand the other side's perspective, their fears, and their needs. A great example is the post-WW2 Marshall Plan. Instead of punishing Germany, the US provided massive aid to help rebuild Europe. This act of empathy and enlightened self-interest led to decades of peace and prosperity.
A fantastic example of a win-win situation.
Yes. Third, a commitment to justice and fairness. This means adhering to international law and accepting rulings from neutral bodies like the International Court of Justice, even if they go against your immediate interest. For instance, resolving maritime border disputes through legal arbitration rather than military posturing is an ethical approach. Fourth, the concept of shared responsibility for global commons. Problems like climate change, pandemics, and ocean pollution don't respect national borders. No single nation can solve them alone. The Paris Agreement on climate change is an example of countries trying to work together based on a shared ethical responsibility to protect the planet. It's not about one nation's interest, but the interest of all humanity.
So ethics helps redefine national interest itself.
That's the perfect way to phrase it for the conclusion. The conclusion is that ethical considerations are not a naive alternative to national interest. They are essential for its intelligent pursuit in an interconnected world. By fostering mutual respect, empathy, and a sense of shared responsibility, ethics can help nations redefine their interests, moving from short-sighted zero-sum competition to long-term positive-sum cooperation.
Brilliant. Let's wrap up with the cross questions. First, how can we use Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam effectively in this answer?
Use it in the introduction to propose an alternative to the narrow national interest mindset, and then bring it back in the conclusion to show how this ethical worldview can resolve tensions. It gives the answer a strong philosophical anchor.
Second, what's the difference between a zero-sum and a positive-sum game in international relations?
In a zero-sum game, like a war for territory, the total gains and losses add up to zero. One side's +1 is the other's -1. In a positive-sum game, like a free trade agreement, both sides can benefit. It's not about dividing a fixed pie, but about working together to make the pie bigger for everyone.
Great explanation. Third, why was the Marshall Plan an example of enlightened self-interest?
Because while it was an ethical act of helping former enemies, It was also smart policy for the US. A stable and prosperous Europe became a strong trading partner and a bulwark against the spread of communism. So by helping others, America also helped itself. It shows that ethics and self-interest are not always opposed.
Fourth, how does the Paris Agreement demonstrate an ethical approach?
It's based on the ethical principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It acknowledges that all countries have a shared responsibility to fight climate change, but recognizes that developed countries, which have historically polluted more, have a greater duty to lead and to help developing nations. This is a principle of fairness and justice.
And our final question for the entire discussion. Can ethics realistically overcome the powerful drive of national interest?
It's not about ethics overcoming national interest, but about ethics informing and expanding it. The most realistic and sustainable national interest in the 21st century is one that recognizes that our security and prosperity are deeply tied to the security and prosperity of others. The ethical path is also the most rational path in the long run.
A perfect concluding thought. Okay, dosto, for the last time, let's practice. Rehearse. By applying ethical considerations like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, nations can transform zero-sum conflicts of national interest into positive-sum opportunities for shared global progress.
In short, a narrow focus on national interest leads to conflict. Ethical principles like empathy, justice, and shared responsibility can redefine national interest and create win-win solutions for global tensions.
Wow, what a massive journey. We've covered 10 incredibly important questions, analyzing them ethically from every angle. I feel like my brain just got a major upgrade. Let's do a quick final recap.
Bilkul, it's been a marathon, but a crucial one. Here's what we've seen: war and politics. Clausewitz's idea is still relevant, but modern ethics and new forms of warfare have made it a far more dangerous and complicated equation. Climate change. This is a crisis born from human greed, and its solution is a deep moral transformation towards sustainable living and global justice. Peace and arms. We saw the great paradox. Powerful nations talk peace, but sell arms. True peace requires them to prioritize humanity over profit. International aid. We learned that aid must be a partnership of justice and empowerment, not a paternalistic charity with strings attached. Russia-Ukraine war. This conflict is a stark reminder of the importance of just war theory and the devastating consequences when its principles are violated. Corporate social responsibility, CSR. We concluded that CSR is an insufficient first step. The future is embedding accountability into the core of business itself. Refugees. We affirmed that democratic nations have a non-negotiable moral duty to protect refugees, balancing security with fundamental human dignity. Will to power. This realist drive is real, but it can and must be tamed by rationality, international law, and a shared sense of moral duty. Pillars of IR. Strength, peace, and security are interconnected. True stability comes from balancing all three, with a modern focus on human security and positive peace. National interest versus ethics. And finally, we saw that ethics can transform the zero-sum game of national interest into a win-win game of global cooperation. जाते जाते एक सवाल छोड़ जाती हूँ दोस्त. हमने national interest की बात की, but in a deeply interconnected world facing global problems like climate change, pandemics, and AI regulation, what is the true national interest anymore? क्या एक देश अकेले safe या prosperous रह सकता है जब पूरी दुनिया खतरे में हो? इस पर सोचना जरूर.
That is a brilliant point to end on. It changes the entire perspective. तो दोस्तों, सोचते रहिए, सीखते रहिए. अगर ये डिस्कशन पसंद आई तो इसे अपने दोस्तों के साथ शेयर करना, लाइक, कमेंट एंड मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंटली सब्सक्राइब फॉर मोर सच डीप एनालिसिस. मिलते हैं अगले एपिसोड में.